I need both of you to show me your IDs right now. What are you doing in this neighborhood?
Officer, is there a problem? We're just having lunch. We're customers here. We ordered food. We're eating.
I've got complaints about suspicious individuals. I think you're casing the area for break-ins. I think you're planning something.
Eating we paid for. On what basis are you asking for ID? We haven't committed any crime.
Hashtag racist cop tries to kick two black men out of diner. Unaware their undercover detectives officer Craig Mitchell, badge number 7458 with 6 years on the Riverside Municipal Police Department, walked into Tony's Diner on Elm Street at 2:30 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon and immediately noticed two black men sitting in a booth near the window, dressed in casual street clothes, speaking quietly to each other over coffee and lunch. Without observing any disruptive behavior, without receiving any complaints from staff or other customers, and despite the fact that the two men were simply sitting in a public restaurant eating a meal like the dozen other customers present, Mitchell's racist assumptions kicked in immediately as he decided these two men didn't belong in this predominantly white neighborhood diner and needed to be removed. Mitchell approached the booth with an aggressive posture, his hand resting on his service weapon in an obvious attempt at intimidation, and without any greeting or professional courtesy, demanded, "I need to see both your IDs right now, and I need to know what you're doing in this neighborhood." When the two men, Detective Marcus Johnson, age 38, with 14 years on the Riverside Police Department's Major Crimes Unit, and Detective James Williams, age 35, with 11 years on the same unit, calmly looked up from their lunch and asked, "Officer, is there a problem? We're just having lunch." Mitchell responded by claiming he'd received complaints about suspicious individuals loitering in the area, accused the two men of casing the neighborhood for potential break-ins, and ordered them to provide identification and explain their presence or be arrested for trespassing and vagrancy despite them sitting in a restaurant they had every legal right to patronize. Despite Detective Johnson calmly explaining, "We're customers here. We ordered food, we're eating lunch. We haven't broken any laws." And despite the diner's owner, Tony Martinez, immediately approaching to tell Mitchell, "Officer, these gentlemen are my customers. They come here regularly. There's no problem here." Mitchell dismissed both explanations, claimed the owner was probably being intimidated, insisted the two men were lying about being legitimate customers, and escalated by grabbing Detective Williams's arm and announcing, "You're both being detained for investigation of suspicious activity. Stand up and put your hands where I can see them," while other diners watched in shock and began recording on their phones. What Officer Mitchell didn't know, what his racial profiling and assumption that two black men in a diner must be criminals rather than the obvious truth that they were customers eating lunch had prevented him from discovering, was that he had just grabbed the arm of Detective James Williams, an 11-year veteran detective currently working an undercover narcotics investigation in the area, and that Detective Williams's partner, Detective Marcus Johnson, was not only a 14-year decorated detective but was also the nephew of Riverside's chief of police, and most devastatingly for Mitchell's career, both detectives were armed with their service weapons concealed under their civilian clothes, were carrying their police credentials and detective badges, had been conducting surveillance on a drug trafficking suspect who frequented businesses in this neighborhood, and had stopped at Tony's Diner for lunch during their surveillance shift. A fact that was documented in their official police reports filed that morning with their supervisor, Lieutenant Sarah Chun, who would be horrified to learn one of her undercover detectives had been physically grabbed by a uniformed officer who was too blinded by racism to conduct even basic investigation before escalating to force. Mitchell's decision to physically detain two undercover detectives eating lunch based solely on racist assumptions that black men in a white neighborhood must be criminals would result in immediate intervention by the detective's lieutenant. Mitchell's suspension within hours. Viral video footage reaching 95 million views showing a uniformed cop trying to remove undercover detectives from a diner. Mitchell's termination within 72 hours. Criminal charges for assault on law enforcement officers and deprivation of rights under color of law. A $450,000 settlement paid to both detectives for the humiliation and civil rights violation. And Mitchell's permanent ban from law enforcement, while the two detectives he'd racially profiled continued their distinguished careers, with Detective Johnson eventually being promoted to sergeant and Detective Williams becoming a trainer on implicit bias and constitutional policing for the entire department. Before we go further, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing where you're tuning in from. If you believe detectives should be able to eat lunch without being racially profiled, then like this video and subscribe. Detective Marcus Johnson and Detective James Williams had been partners in the Riverside Police Department's Major Crimes Unit for 6 years, building a professional relationship based on mutual respect, complementary skills, and a shared commitment to constitutional policing. At 38 and 35 years old respectively, both were experienced investigators who had worked their way up from patrol to detective positions through excellent casework, community relationships, and dedication to their profession. On this particular Thursday, they were working an undercover narcotics investigation targeting a mid-level drug trafficker named Devin Pierce who was suspected of distributing cocaine and methamphetamine throughout Riverside and the surrounding communities. The investigation had been ongoing for 3 months, with Johnson and Williams conducting surveillance on Pierce's known associates, documenting his movements, and building a case for search warrants and eventual arrest. Their surveillance had brought them to Elm Street, a commercial area in a predominantly white, middle-class neighborhood where Pierce had been observed meeting with potential buyers at various businesses. The detective's assignment for the day was to maintain visual surveillance on a pawn shop 2 blocks from Tony's Diner, where Pierce was expected to meet an associate around 3 p.m. At 1:45 p.m., Johnson and Williams had taken a break from their surveillance position to grab lunch. Both were dressed in casual civilian clothes, jeans, polo shirts, sneakers appropriate for undercover work. Both were armed with their concealed service weapons and carried their detective badges and police credentials, though these were concealed to maintain their cover. They'd chosen Tony's Diner because it was a known good restaurant in the area. It had a window booth that provided a sight line to the pawn shop they were surveilling, and Detective Williams had eaten there several times over the past month during the investigation and had always received good service. The owner, Tony Martinez, a friendly man in his 60s who had run the diner for 25 years, recognized Williams and greeted both detectives warmly when they entered. "Detectives, good to see you," Tony had said, though quietly enough that other customers wouldn't overhear the word detectives. He knew from previous conversations that Williams was working undercover in the area. "Hey Tony," Williams had replied, "just grabbing lunch. Can we get the booth by the window?" Of course. I'll send Rebecca right over." The detectives had settled into the booth, ordered lunch. Johnson got a cheeseburger and fries. Williams ordered the turkey club sandwich, and were eating while discussing their case in low voices, occasionally glancing out the window toward their surveillance target location. They were halfway through their meal, discussing the next steps in their investigation, when Officer Craig Mitchell walked into the diner. Mitchell, 32 years old with 6 years on the Riverside Municipal Police Department, a separate agency from the Riverside PD where Johnson and Williams worked. The city had both a municipal police force and a county sheriff's department with overlapping jurisdictions, had a troubling record that his supervisors had failed to properly address. Over 6 years, Mitchell had received 11 formal complaints, 6 complaints alleging racial profiling, 3 complaints alleging harassment, 2 complaints alleging excessive force. Of those 11 complaints, 9 had been dismissed by supervisors as unsubstantiated without thorough investigation. The other 2 had resulted in verbal counseling with no real consequences. Mitchell's statistics showed disturbing patterns. 71% of his stops involved people of color despite his patrol area being only 42% minority. His arrest rate for black individuals was 4.8 times higher than for white individuals in the same area. And 38% of his arrests resulted in dropped charges or acquittals, indicating he was making arrests without sufficient probable cause. When Mitchell entered Tony's Diner on his lunch break and saw 2 black men in casual clothes sitting in a booth, his biased assumptions immediately activated. Without considering any innocent explanation for their presence, customers eating lunch, residents of the neighborhood, businesspeople on break, undercover law enforcement, etc., Mitchell decided they were suspicious and needed to be questioned. Mitchell walked directly to the booth where Johnson and Williams were sitting, his hand moving to rest on his service weapon, an aggressive, threatening posture when approaching people who were simply eating lunch. "I need to see both your IDs right now, and I need to know what you're doing in this neighborhood," Mitchell announced loudly enough that other diners turned to look. Johnson and Williams exchanged a quick glance. Both immediately recognized what was happening. They were being racially profiled by a uniformed officer who had made assumptions based on their race rather than any observable criminal behavior. Williams, the more senior in years of service, responded calmly. "Officer, is there a problem? We're just having lunch." Mitchell's face showed he expected immediate compliance, not questions. "I asked for your IDs. I need to see identification from both of you, and I need to know what you're doing here." Johnson set down his burger and wiped his hands on his napkin, buying time to assess the situation. As an experienced detective, he knew this was a Fourth Amendment issue. Mitchell had no reasonable suspicion to demand identification from people eating in a restaurant. But he also knew that escalating confrontations with uniformed officers could turn dangerous, even when you were in the right. "Officer," Johnson said professionally, "we're customers at this restaurant. We ordered food, we're eating lunch. We haven't broken any laws. On what basis are you requesting our identification?" Mitchell's face reddened. He clearly wasn't used to being questioned about his authority. "I've received complaints about suspicious individuals loitering in this area. You two match the description. You need to provide ID and explain what you're doing here, or you're going to be arrested for trespassing and vagrancy." Williams's jaw tightened. He knew no such complaints existed. Mitchell was fabricating justification after the fact. "Officer, we're sitting in a restaurant eating lunch that we paid for. That's not loitering. We're customers. What specific complaint are you responding to?" Mitchell pointed at them accusingly. "I think you're casing this neighborhood for potential break-ins. I think you're criminals. Show me your IDs now." Tony Martinez, the diner owner, had been watching from behind the counter and now approached the booth. "Officer, excuse me, but these gentlemen are my customers. They come here regularly. They've ordered food, they're eating. There's no problem here." Mitchell glared at Tony. "Sir, step back. These individuals are being detained for investigation. You're probably being intimidated by them. They're not welcome here." Tony's eyes widened. "Officer, I'm the owner of this establishment. I'm telling you they are welcome here. They're my customers. They haven't done anything wrong." Mitchell dismissed Tony's statement. "I'll decide who's done something wrong. You too," he turned back to Johnson and Williams. "Stand up and put your hands where I can see them. You're being detained." At this point, several other diners had pulled out their phones and were recording the confrontation. An elderly white woman in a nearby booth called out, "Officer, they're just eating lunch. Leave them alone." Mitchell ignored her and reached for Williams's arm, grabbing it roughly. "I said stand up. You're being detained for investigation of suspicious activity." Williams, with 11 years of law enforcement experience and extensive training in de-escalation, made a split-second decision. Mitchell had now crossed from unlawful stop into physical assault, grabbing someone without legal justification. It was time to end this before it escalated further. Williams calmly pulled his concealed badge from his waistband and held it up at eye level. "Officer Mitchell, I'm Detective James Williams, Riverside Police Department, Major Crimes Unit, badge number 2847. This is my partner, Detective Marcus Johnson, badge 2913. We're undercover, conducting a narcotics surveillance operation. You need to remove your hand from my arm right now." The color drained from Mitchell's face. He released Williams's arm and took a step back, his mouth opening and closing but no words coming out. Johnson also displayed his badge, holding it calmly but visibly. "Officer Mitchell, we're both sworn law enforcement officers. We've been conducting authorized surveillance in this area for 3 months as part of an ongoing investigation. We stopped for lunch during our shift. Everything we're doing is documented in our official reports filed with our supervisor this morning." Mitchell stammered, I didn't know. How was I supposed to know you're cops?" Williams's response was calm but devastating. You weren't supposed to know we're cops. But you also weren't supposed to approach two people eating lunch in a restaurant and demand their IDs, claim they're criminals, grab one of them, and threaten them with arrest, all without any reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. You profiled us based on our race. You saw two black men in a white neighborhood and assumed we were criminals. That's racial profiling, Officer Mitchell, and it's a civil rights violation. Tony Martinez, still standing nearby, shook his head. Officer, I tried to tell you they were customers. These detectives have been coming here for weeks. They're always professional, always respectful. You owe them an apology. Mitchell looked around at the other diners, several of whom were still recording. He seemed to realize the magnitude of his error. I was just doing my job. I thought. You thought two black men didn't belong in this diner, Johnson interrupted. You fabricated claims about complaints and suspicious activity. You grabbed my partner without legal justification. And you did all of this while we were in the middle of an authorized law enforcement operation. Williams pulled out his phone and called his supervisor, Lieutenant Sarachin. Lieutenant, this is Williams. We have a situation at Tony's Diner on Elm. A uniformed officer from Municipal PD just racially profiled us, demanded our IDs without cause, and physically grabbed me during our surveillance operation. Yes, ma'am. Badge 7458. Yes, ma'am, we're fine. Several witnesses recorded it. Yes, ma'am. Williams ended the call. Our lieutenant is contacting your department. She'll be here in 10 minutes, and so will your supervisor. Mitchell's face showed he understood his career was likely over. Within minutes, both Lieutenant Chun from Riverside PD and Sergeant Davis from Municipal PD arrived at the diner. Lieutenant Chun, a 20-year veteran known for her no-nonsense approach to supervision, listened as Johnson and Williams explained what had occurred, reviewed the video recorded by customers, and then turned to Mitchell with barely controlled fury. Officer Mitchell, you just assaulted one of my detectives during an authorized undercover operation. You racially profiled two law enforcement officers. You fabricated justification for a stop. You ignored the property owner telling you these were his customers. And you did all of this in front of multiple witnesses with cameras. Do you understand the severity of what you've done? Sergeant Davis, Mitchell's supervisor, looked equally appalled as he reviewed the customer videos. Mitchell, you're suspended effective immediately. Turn in your badge and weapon. Report to the station for a formal statement. Mitchell tried to defend himself. Sarge, I thought they looked suspicious. I was trying to what? Sergeant Davis cut him off. They were eating lunch. What exactly looked suspicious about two men eating lunch? The fact that they were black? Is that what made them suspicious to you? Mitchell had no answer. The investigation into Mitchell's conduct moved swiftly. The customer videos were clear and damning. They showed Mitchell approaching the booth aggressively with his hand on his weapon. Mitchell demanding IDs without articulating any reasonable suspicion. Mitchell fabricating claims about complaints and suspicious activity. Tony Martinez telling Mitchell the men were his customers, ignored by Mitchell. Mitchell claiming the men were casing the neighborhood based on nothing. Mitchell grabbing Detective Williams's arm without legal justification. The reveal of the detective's badges and Mitchell's shocked reaction. Multiple witnesses objecting to Mitchell's conduct. The videos went viral within 24 hours, reaching 95 million views. The image of a uniformed officer trying to kick two undercover detectives out of a diner because of their race became a national symbol of how racial profiling operates even within law enforcement. The internal investigation uncovered Mitchell's pattern. 11 complaints over 6 years. 9 dismissed without investigation. 71% of stops involving minorities in 42% minority area. 4.8x higher arrest rate for black individuals versus white. 38% dismissal rate for charges indicating arrests without cause. The Municipal Police Department, facing viral videos, public outrage, and the humiliation of having one of their officers assault detectives from another agency, terminated Mitchell within 72 hours. But termination wasn't the end. The district attorney filed criminal charges against Mitchell. 1. assault on a law enforcement officer, state charge, physical contact with Detective Williams 2, deprivation of rights under color of law, federal charge, 18 U.S.C. Section 242, violating constitutional rights based on race 3, official misconduct, state charge, abusing police authority 4, interference with law enforcement operations, state charge, disrupting an authorized undercover investigation. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution presented the customer videos, testimony from both detectives, testimony from Tony Martinez, expert testimony on Fourth Amendment requirements for stops, and statistical evidence of Mitchell's bias pattern. The jury convicted Mitchell on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 18 months in jail, with possibility of parole after 12 months, and permanent disqualification from law enforcement. Mitchell was also added to the national database of officers terminated for misconduct. Detectives Johnson and Williams filed a joint civil rights lawsuit seeking $450,000 in damages for the humiliation, civil rights violation, interference with their official duties, and the message that needed to be sent about racial profiling. The Municipal Police Department settled for the full amount, with each detective receiving $225,000. The settlement agreement included comprehensive reforms, mandatory implicit bias training for all officers, new policies requiring articulable reasonable suspicion before any investigative stop, discipline for officers who fabricate justifications after the fact, better tracking of complaints to identify problem officers, coordination between agencies to prevent interference with undercover operations. 3 years after the incident, Detective Marcus Johnson has been promoted to sergeant and now supervises a team of detectives in major crimes. Detective James Williams became a department trainer, teaching courses on implicit bias, constitutional policing, and de-escalation. His training includes the story of his own experience being racially profiled while undercover, and he uses it to teach officers about the damage caused by racial assumptions. Tony's Diner saw an increase in business after the incident, with community members deliberately supporting a business owner who had stood up for his customers. Tony added a sign near the entrance: "All customers welcome. We judge you by your character, not your appearance." Craig Mitchell, now 35, works in warehouse logistics after being unable to find law enforcement employment due to his criminal record and termination database listing. He completed 12 months in jail and continues paying off legal debts from his criminal case. The viral video of Mitchell trying to remove 2 undercover detectives from a diner continues to be used in law enforcement training across the country as an example of how racial profiling can lead to career-destroying mistakes. Lieutenant Sarah Chan, the detective's supervisor, reflected on the incident in an interview. "My detectives were doing their jobs, conducting authorized surveillance as part of a narcotics investigation. They took a lunch break as they're allowed to do, and they were treated as criminals by a uniformed officer who saw their race before he saw their humanity. That officer's bias didn't just violate their rights, it could have blown their undercover operation, endangered their investigation, and put them at risk. Racial profiling isn't just morally wrong. It's operationally dangerous and legally indefensible." Detective Williams, when speaking to officer trainees, tells them, "When Officer Mitchell approached our table, he had already decided we were criminals. He wasn't investigating, he was confirming his bias. He ignored the restaurant owner. He fabricated complaints. He made assumptions based on race rather than behavior. And when those assumptions proved wrong, he'd already committed assault, violated our rights, and destroyed his own career. The lesson is simple. Investigate facts, not skin color. Respect rights, don't assume criminality. And understand that the person you're profiling might be a fellow officer, a business owner, an attorney, a doctor, or in our case, detectives with more years of experience than you. Judge people by their actions, not their appearance." The case of the 2 undercover detectives racially profiled in a diner remains a powerful reminder that racial bias can cause law enforcement officers to see fellow professionals, law-abiding citizens, and even other cops as threats simply because of the color of their skin. And officers who let that bias override their judgment will face criminal prosecution, termination, civil liability, and permanent career destruction. If you believe detectives should be able to eat lunch without being racially profiled, share this story. And if you think 18 months in jail plus a $450,000 settlement is exactly the accountability needed when cops assault other cops based on racist assumptions, subscribe for more stories where racial profiling meets justice, even when the victims have badges of their own. Word count: 3,244 words.